couple of months ago, I got a craving for swords and sandals tales, specifically the mythical tales of ancient Arabia. You know, those kind of stories that have magical lamps, jinns, men with curved swords, turbans and chasing buckets of gold, things like Aladdin, Sinbad and Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves. I came across the Nights, or Arabian Nights, or 1001 Arabian Nights, also known as 1001 Nights. What this is a collection of Arabic folklore tales compiled during the Islamic Golden Age. The works have been collected and compiled over a number of centuries by travelers, scholars and translators, and the stories themselves have Arabic, Persian, Greek, Indian, Turkish and Jewish origins. There is an initial frame story which is the backbone of the entire book. It concerns a king who finds out that his wife has been getting jiggy with a slave and he has her executed. In his madness and fury, he vows to marry a virgin and kill her in the morning, which he does so repeatedly until he runs out of virgins. He then tasks his vizier with finding one lest he lose his life, and the vizier painstakingly tries to locate one unsuccessfully, and before he is resigned to his fate, his daughter offers herself, met with pleading and forbidding from her father. She goes through it anyway, marrying the king, but with a plan. On their wedding night, she tells him a story, and as he gets lost in the wondrous nature of her tale, and just before she reaches the climax, she declares that daybreak has come and she cannot continue and must do so the next night. So the king delays her execution so he can hear the rest of the story. And when she finishes that story, the next night she starts another, promising this one to be more wondrous, and another, and thus we have the framework for the Arabian Nights. The tales themselves vary wildly. You have some stories dipped in historical groundwork, though many are completely fictional. There are many love stories, tragedies, comedies, and even erotica. The first question that arises when wanting to read the Nights is which version should you get? Some editions contain a handful of stories, others actually include 1001 tales, and some even more so. There are stories that concern Sinbad and Ali Baba and Aladdin, but these aren't actually part of the original tales and were added much later. There were 3 versions that I came across. One was essentially an Arabian Nights for children, which I instantly rejected as it was simply a kid's book. There was another which was a detailed English translation of the Arabic text, but it had been edited to make sense with the way we speak now. The modern prose was welcoming and easy to understand, but when I put it side by side with another work which was more faithful, it came off as sanitized and stripped of its exquisite literature. Because one thing I came to notice was in many cases of the stories in the Nights, the joy doesn't come from the stories themselves, but the way in which they are told. After all, the Arabs prided themselves on their poetry and literature, so I chose to go for the version by Richard F. Burton, the famous explorer and Orientalist of the 19th century. Just the first volume for now, the first of 10. This version is pretty incredible as it contains, firstly, an introduction in which Burton details his travels and exploration of Arabia and his encountering of the Nights and telling the stories to Bedouins around campfires late at night. He provides context for the world in which the Nights are set and how the tales came to be about, and his translation is pretty much direct, with all the nuances, subtleties and intricacies of the Arabic language remaining intact, with just a few changes here and there to accommodate an English-speaking person and things that are lost in translation. There's a lot of these and lows and thou hasts, but you get used to it, and it helps your own vocabulary expand. Burton also provides extremely helpful footnotes, explaining certain passages or words which highlight his vast observation skills and knowledge, although I did notice just a few misconceptions here and there. The quality of the stories vary. In general, they are a pretty great read, and sometimes I read and reread a passage or line that just hits me with its skillfulness. Often a character in the wife's story will break into a story of his own, and in that story you may get another character telling a story, meaning the narrative texture is richly layered. The effect of this can also be varied, in that sometimes it can get confusing and you forget who is telling what story, and this new tale interrupts the flow of the previous one, but many times it's used to amazing effect, and the stories within stories often have parallel ironies running through them. Some of the highlights of the first volume include one of the first stories where a man unknowingly kills a jinn by randomly throwing stones at a lake, and the father of the jinn manifests and gives him a small amount of time before he settles his accounts, before he says he's going to kill him. The man sits by a tree and cries, and is approached by an old man with an animal, who after hearing about his situation, sits with him and comforts him. Then 2 more old men arrive, and then the jinn, who takes the man and prepares to kill him. But the first old man asks for a pardon of 1/3 of the man's life by telling him that the animal he has with him was once one of his family members, and the tale of how it became an animal is wondrous, and he will tell the story if the jinn agrees to give him 1/3 of the man's life, and then he tells the story. Then the second and third man do the same, thus resulting in the man being released. There's another brilliant story, among many, involving a tailor accidentally having a hunchback die in his company at home, and fearing a murder charge, he throws him at the top of the stairs of a doctor's home. The doctor ends up coming out of his home and tripping over the man, who tumbles down the stairs, and he thinks he's killed him. So he throws him over a neighbour's wall, and the neighbour, thinking he's a robber, beats him, but then he thinks he's accidentally killed him. It kind of goes on like that until everyone who thought they killed the man is taken to the king, who finds the story hilarious, and then he challenges each of them to tell a better one. And all the stories are pretty great, especially the last one, which rounds off the volume 1 of the Nights with a bang, and which contains about 10 stories within it. When reading, you have to bear in mind that it seems the conventions of storytelling are a lot different from what we might expect, as you'd think would be the case with with the time period and place in which these stories were cultivated. For example, someone might be the main character in a story, and then halfway through he randomly dies of illness, and the story completely switches to being about his nephew, say for example. Or a story might cover a few days of a person's life in great detail, and then say, for example, he lived happily ever after and then he died, and then continues the story from his son's point of view. Also, when the wife chooses to cut off the story short, are not what we might consider a cliffhanger, as sometimes instead of the protagonist clinging on for dear life or about to be executed, stories can be paused in the middle of speeches, and in one case a description of the human anatomy, all in the guise of piquing the king's interest and prolonging her life. I had a great time with the first volume, but I don't see myself going for part 2 anytime soon. I've had my fill for now, and it took me a long time to get through the first volume, and while I was reading it there were a lot of other books that attracted me, so I think I'll give the Nights a break for a while and try a few other books.